Welcome back to our Institute's Colloquium. It is my pleasure to introduce today Nicolas Schillinger, who's a cultural historian of 19th and 20th century China with a focus on the history of science and the history of masculinity. Nicolas received his PhD from Heidelberg University, where he was a member of the cluster Asia and Europe in a global context. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Graduate School for East Asian Studies and a lecturer and visiting professor at the Institute of Chinese Studies at Freie Universität, just next door. After a one-year stay at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, he is now a member of the Institute of East Asian Studies at the University of Duisburg-Essen. So you might have seen the update to our website on that. His first book, The Body and Military Masculinity in Late Qing and Early Republican China, The Art of Governing Soldiers, dealt with military reforms and its cultural, social, and political consequences, as well as the changing concept of masculinity in China between 1895 and 1916. He is currently working on his second book, tentatively titled Scientizing an Army, Military Medicine, and Life Sciences in Republican China, and on two research articles, so keep your eyes open for those, soon to be published, titled Bodybuilding and Masculinity in Republican China, and also the so-called Biochemical Race Index and Blood Group Research in Republican China. And with this, I'd like to give the floor to Nicolas Schillinger. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. So before I start, I would like to thank Dora for inviting me to the Colloquium series and for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my research with you and, of course, with all the people joining us with Zoom. Okay, I would like to start with a quote from the preface of a Chinese booklet with the title Bacteriological Warfare, published in 1942. Quote unquote, the next wars will not consist of hand-to-hand fighting. They will exclusively be scientific wars. Victory will be decided by the quality of science. So the author Chen Feimore attributed this statement to the French general Ferdinand Foch, who, as a commander-in-chief of the Allied forces during World War I, was a conservative military strategist rather indifferent to new military technologies. So I think this fact and this quote sums up the increasing importance accorded to science for military purposes around the world since World War I, as well as the topic of my talk today, which is scientific warfare and the link between science, the military, and war in China from the late 1920s to the late 1940s. Like other military organizations around the world, Chinese armies were keenly interested in possessing and mastering the latest, most advanced military technology, which in the 20th century became nothing less than applied science or scientific engineering, as historian Barton Hacker writes. The Army of the Republic of China, the National Revolutionary Army commanded by Chiang Kai-shek, you might have heard of him, acquired tanks, aircraft, guns, equipment, and much more from abroad, and was in urgent need of the service of engineers, physicists, mathematicians, geologists, as many other scientists who were essential for the deployment, production, and application of new technologies and weapons, but also conducted basic research or were responsible for the allocation and management of resources. The National Revolutionary Army gradually established several technical schools, such as a military engineering school, a school of Air Force Technology, or an Air Force Technological Institute, as well as research institutes such as a Nutrition Research Institute, a Physical Research Bureau, an Applied Chemistry Research Office, or an Optical Weapons Research Institute. So in summary, there was a strong urge, at least among modernizing military elites, to scientize the army. And I will say more about that term later. So today, you don't have to worry, I would like to talk not so much about science and technology in the Chinese military, but more about the discourses and the debate about the general relationship between science and war in China at the time. So this debate, which reached its peak in the 1930s, dealt with various issues such as the general purpose of science, the responsibility of scientists in society, or the role of humans and technology in war. In early 20th century China, science included science-based knowledge as well as ways of thinking and rationalizing was uncommon, and most parts of the population regarded science with skepticism. as one would expect, I guess. I argue that war, and by extension the military, were fundamental to the understanding and acceptance of science in China. And today in my presentation, limited as it might be, I would like to provide some evidence and some examples for this argument. Just one image I forgot to show you is just to illustrate like the interest of the National Revolutionary Army in scientific technology, if you want to put it like that. Before discussing the debate in the 1930s and 1940s, I would like to briefly review the development of science, or modern science, if you want, in China from the early 20th century onwards. From about the mid-19th century to the early 20th century, scholars in late imperial China or the Qing Empire used the existing term 歌无知知 to grasp the concept of science. Literally meaning investigation of things and extension of knowledge, the term stood primarily for physics, chemistry, and other natural sciences. It represented the practice of absorbing and adapting new forms of knowledge to established categories, depending on translations, the use and eventual adaptation of existing vocabulary, and the introduction of new terms. After the Boxer War in 1900 to 1901, a growing number of Chinese students went to Japan, the United States, and Europe, and then enrolled at universities and military schools. In 1914, 1915, Chinese students at Cornell University founded the Science Society of China and published the pioneering journal Science. The members of the Science Society were the first generation of professional scientists who had received their full education at foreign universities, and their views were very influential throughout the Republican period. They regarded science as a universal truth and advocated the idea of saving the country through science. By this time, the term 科学, which comes from the Japanese for science, had become established. In 1915, Zhang Duxiu, a leading proponent of the groundbreaking intellectual new culture, or May 4th movement, later co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party, posed the question, what is science? And this was noticed quite widely. According to Zhang Duxiu, it was a force of rationality and renewal that opposed what he claimed were traditional Chinese superstition and stagnation. In the early Republican period, many leading scholars and intellectuals discussed this question in terms of the political and moral nature of science, practically relying on a Confucian understanding of knowledge and knowledge formation. In 1923, Zhang Junmai, a professor of philosophy at Tsinghua University, and Ding Wenjiang, a geologist, debated whether science could replace philosophy and metaphysics in answering certain questions about, simply put, the meaning of life. The proponents of science essentially propagated what Daniel Kwok many years ago called scientism, which held that the application of scientific methodology made everything in the universe intelligible. The result was a rather orthodox and positivist conception of science as a homogeneous, unchanging entity and an all-encompassing quasi-religious truth. Science was to save China and ensure its return to wealth and glory. So these were some of the important slogans: save China and return to wealth and glory. So Grace Chen, I think from Fordham University, has pointed out that the focus of historical scholarship on these intellectual debates has led to the impression that science in China mattered primarily as an ideology or social theory. And scientists who participated in these debates appeared only as political activists. However, the way science was adopted and shaped institutionally, individually, and epistemologically during the late Qing and Republican period have been neglected, attaching to the history of science in modern China the quote-unquote stigma of utilitarianism. So in this narrative, science in China had only quote-unquote instrumental value, and there was no understanding of the complex theoretical foundations of science and no real comprehension of its true meaning and full dimension. So after failing to develop modern science in Joseph Needham's view, the Chinese failed again in appropriating science from the West. So that's her summary, basically, of historical scholarship on science in China. So in my talk, while I cannot fully resolve this issue, I try to add another dimension by focusing primarily on the scientists who participated in the debate and showing how their research and the adoption of science were influenced by war and military issues. Against the background outlined above, and under the impression of World War I, Chinese scientists reflected on, one might say, intertwining of science and war. One of the first articles appeared in the journal Science and was written by the journal's co-founder and editor-in-chief Yang Xingfu, who was also co-founder of Science Society and studied economics in the United States at the time. So I'm not going to bother you a lot with names and biographies. I'm just showing you some of the most important people participating in the debate. And I will return to those people later. But without any major biography. So back to Yang Qifu in his first article. His article was published in 1915 and titled War and Science. Yang argued that contrary to conventional wisdom that science serves war and made the Great War in Europe possible, war actually serves science. That is, war triggered scientific research and breakthroughs in many fields, such as electrical engineering, medicine, or agricultural and chemical sciences, all of which contributed to the war in one way or another. However, science is naturally used to the detriment of people during war, he writes, which he considered as insane, barbaric, and a misappropriation. Ultimately, Yang ended his article, people could go to war any time, with or without science, and it's their choice whether to use science or how to use it. So scientists, intellectuals, military people, and politicians continued to discuss the relationship between science and war in the years that followed. With the establishment of the Republic of China in 1927 to 1928, led by a science-minded nationalist party government and under the influence of similar discourses in Europe, the United States, Soviet Union, and Japan, terms such as scientific warfare, future war, or forthcoming next wars, scientizing war or scientizing the army became ubiquitous in China. Between the end of the First World War and 1918 and the beginning of World War II in 1939, virtually all European armies and governments prepared for a new military conflict that would be even more severe than the First World War. Many politicians and military theoreticians predicted that this next war would be an inevitable total war, fully involving nation states and their entire population, economies, and industries. Well, however, another school of military thought advocated avoiding total war by using highly specialized forces with advanced technology and science to quickly defeat the enemy by destroying its nerve centers before entire countries and mass armies could even be mobilized. So they developed plans for the tactical and strategic use of science and of tanks and air power, including the concept of mechanization or the popular dictum of blitzkrieg, as well as many other novel military, technological, and scientific developments. Chinese observers, at that time especially military theorists, followed these debates very closely from World War I, and they recognized that future wars would be fundamentally different from all previous wars. Wars would become wars of knowledge that would exploit the full potential of science, and they were among the first to call for the scientization of the Chinese army. According to one author, all major foreign powers sought to scientize their arsenals and massively promote military research with the single and urgent goal of converging science and military knowledge. Converging scientific and military knowledge. So, quote unquote, science converged to war, war converges to science, one author noted, proclaiming that with the persistence of war, science would become all-powerful. Military preparation to win or to prevent war required the pursuit of scientific progress. So the idea of scientizing the army emerged also in the context of a broad movement of the nationalist government to scientize Chinese society, politics, and culture in the early 1930s. And there's just one very nice example, very nice book by Zhanzheng Lei, who talks about the scientization of medicine in China. And he writes a lot about this term, and just as a recommendation, if you want to get into this debate or know more about this debate. The goal of this movement was to increase popular acceptance of science so that it could contribute to the preservation of the state. It included the introduction of science-based education in schools and the promotion of a rational, science-based lifestyle among society, for example, through campaigns against superstition or campaigns to promote public health and combat epidemics. It was also supported by more or less independent organizations seeking to promote scientific knowledge, mainly through popular scientific magazines. In addition, the nationalist government attempted to attract scientists to the state, for example, by funding research institutions such as Academia Sinica, or by involving them in the administration of the state. In October 1932, the government established the National Defense Commission, which became the National Resource Commission in 1935, which was an institution that was basically a scientific think tank, symbolizing the scientization of government, as one contemporary author wrote. The preoccupation with scientizing the army, and then more broadly, the notion of scientific warfare, really began with the so-called Shanghai incident in 1932. After the Japanese government had occupied northwest China or Manchuria the year before, Chinese and Japanese forces now clashed directly in and around Shanghai, the most economically important Chinese city. Chinese observers were widely viewed the Shanghai incident, which had demonstrated Japanese military superiority, as a prelude to a full-scale Japanese invasion that then took place in 1937. So in March 1932, and that's where the debate then really begins, for instance, while the fighting was still going on, the geologist and meteorologist Zhu Kezhen gave a lecture at the University of Nanjing, in Nanjing, with the title Discussing Scientific Research from the Perspective of War. After confirming that, quote-unquote, modern warfare is scientific warfare, the current fighting in Shanghai showed the technological gap between the Japanese and the Chinese army, he argued. The fundamental difference between the two armies, he writes, is that the Chinese army lacked science. Henceforth, the term scientific warfare was ubiquitous, appearing, for example, in hundreds of official and private journals, in newspaper articles, including military, scientific, and popular publications, as well as speeches, lectures, or military textbooks that explicitly or implicitly treated scientific warfare. And I brought a kind of random collage of different publications, scientific journals, military journals, that all kind of included contributions to this debate. These contributions either generally dealt with the idea of scientific warfare and the military meaning of science and technology, or they sought to highlight and analyze certain aspects thereof, such as aerial warfare or chemical weapons. Articles included translations or original essays, scientific papers, or texts addressing a more general audience, even articles in children's magazines. Many articles and reports included various images, such as photographs, copies of paintings, cutaway drawings or charts, statistics, maps, sketches, or cartoons that powerfully illustrated the link between science and war. The depiction of scientific warfare and scientific weaponry included images of all types of modern military technology, such as aircrafts, battle cruisers, bazookas, submarines, helicopters, and so on and so forth. I believe the frequently appearing photographs of soldiers and others wearing gas masks represents more than anything else the idea of scientific warfare by embodying the most abhorred scientific weapon, poison gas. So I just brought two examples of these images, which are linked to the idea of scientific warfare. And so on this side, you basically have a contribution on bacteriological warfare. It's about biological warfare, which is also discussed a lot in this context. And the other, you see like a military journal with a soldier with a gas mask. And you can basically read, in English, it's Chinese Machinetic Army, but in Chinese, you have like the term is rather scientific army. So he's a scientific soldier or a member of a scientific army. So now, what was this debate really about, and what were the main issues that were raised, and how did it develop? First, scientists, intellectuals, military people, and politicians discussed which scientific disciplines would actually be part of scientific warfare. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, geology, meteorology, or to a lesser extent biology and medicine were mentioned most frequently. So for reasons of time, I will not go into details of all these disciplines, but just give a few examples. Medicine was not mentioned a lot in the context of scientific warfare, but it's also an important part, I would say. Meteorologist Zhu Kezhen published an article entitled "The Impact of the Weather on War," specifically addressing the importance of his own discipline of meteorology for warfare. According to Zhu, from World War I onward, meteorology became particularly important for the detailed calculations of modern artillery and increasingly for air warfare, which not only depended heavily on good weather, but also on correct weather information. The same was true for naval war, as strong winds or dense fog could affect the outcome of any encounter between two fleets. In addition, knowledge of wind directions and strength was essential with regards to poison gas. So some authors went so far as to consider warfare a scientific discipline in its own right, beyond what was commonly understood as military science, which is usually tactics and logistics and stuff like that. Rather, war was a natural science discipline like physics or chemistry, they argued. Mobile military units, for instance, such as cars or armored vehicles, did not move without the combined knowledge of mechanics, thermodynamics, engineering, and other fields, such as astronomy, physical geography, or meteorology in the case of aircrafts. Scientific warfare required a variety of disciplines such as chemistry and pharmacology, optics, for instance, for cameras, civil engineering for the construction of infrastructure, electrical engineering for phones and X-rays, botany, zoology, and cartography. In addition, hygienics, physiology, psychology, pedagogy, philosophy, or even theology might be important for the training of officers and soldiers who may come from a wide range of social backgrounds. So Tao Xisheng, a well-known intellectual and Nationalist Party member who served as a close advisor or ghostwriter to Chiang Kai-shek, expressed his views on scientific warfare in a 1938 lecture in Wuchang, arguing that both the natural and social sciences must be used during war. Natural sciences, he stated, were obviously essential for military technology. The main task of social sciences, he said, was to solve the problem of rural production, since war was embedded in economic processes and conditions. Social sciences had to provide policymakers with tools such as statistics to organize financial systems, production, transportation, and general economic planning. Since China was not industrialized and its economy was largely based on rural production, this war, the war between China and Japan, was also a conflict between rural economy and capitalism between the colonized and imperial invaders. While at present it was necessary to concentrate on fighting the enemy after the war, the social sciences could work on solving social problems and laying the foundations for future society and planning for a new country. Even if the value of social sciences was less obvious compared to the natural sciences, he wrote, or he said, they were both fundamental. So secondly, many contributions dealt with new weapons of mass destruction and novel superweapons that scientists of all the leading powers were supposedly developing, such as chemical and biological weapons, long-range death rays, or wireless remotely controlled aircrafts and ships. So for one example, one important example, in August 1935, the so-called Bureau of Translation and Compilation of Military Studies of the National Revolutionary Army published an extensive compendium entitled Scientific Warfare. In over 400 pages and with more than 100 images, the book covered various topics such as information and communication, aerial warfare, artillery, mechanization, chemical and bacteriological warfare, radio remote control, death waves, and death rays. While it provides an excellent overview over the state of contemporary military technological developments, many topics belonged actually to the realm of science fiction and the military imagination of killing and destruction. So one chapter on superweapons dealt with inaudible acoustic killer waves, which, according to the book, were secretly developed in Europe. Both audible and inaudible sound immediately affected the human central nervous system and brain through the eardrums. Regardless of wavelength, both could be strong enough to send damaging impulses to the brain that had an effect like a blow on the head with a wooden club. Inaudible, and that is ultrasonic sound waves, could be much stronger and therefore more dangerous. Scientific research is on the verge of developing such sonic weapons, the authors argued, which would amount to a revolution in military technology. Another chapter dealt with the so-called death ray. Whether electric waves, I have some images, electric waves or light rays, death rays or force lines were more powerful than earthquakes, volcano explosions, and typhoons, destroying and slicing everything in their path. The authors of the book acknowledged that these death rays existed only in fictional stories so far, but scientists around the world were working to make them a reality. And this was actually true in some ways. Death rays would end all wars as armies could be completely and irrevocably wiped out. The book also goes into various possibilities to construct death rays, starting with the principle to using mirrors to focus light and generate heat. Using light as a weapon, they excitedly implied that scientists gained divine powers. However, the authors of the book concluded that there were several problems with the energy source and a suitable reflecting device to use light beams for military purposes. A suitable apparatus to generate a strong beam would be much too large and the range too small, so it remained a daydream, at least for the time being. The same was true for electric waves or currents, which also had a strong range and were very ineffective. Finally, authors turned to invisible rays, including ultraviolet rays or electromagnetic rays such as X-rays and Y-rays, as well as cosmic rays. If scientists were able to control them and they were powerful enough, they could all be used as weapons to kill people and livestock, to burn, set fire, or explode things. All of this, however, would be topped by a concentrated beam of extraterrestrial cosmic rays, which would be even more devastating and the reason why, quote unquote, all the scientists in the world look up to the starlit sky all night like Jewish scholars foretelling the birth of God's son. So I went into detail here because just to show you that these were not people who wrote about these issues just using their imagination, like they watched a Star Trek episode or something. These people were scientists and they really know about the matter. You can kind of glean that from how they wrote it and what the details they're going into. So it's like a serious deliberations they made here. And developing an omnipotent death ray was not just a fantasy of these people of the Bureau of Translation Compilation or other Chinese people or authors participating in this scientific warfare debate, but it was an internationally widely discussed idea, advocated not only by crackpot science fiction writers or the tabloid press, but also by serious scientists, engineers, and even military officials and politicians, for instance, in Great Britain, Japan, or Germany. In the interview period, there was a veritable death ray craze. Numerous inventors such as Tesla or Marconi claimed to have successfully constructed a kind of energy beam that crippled, exploded, or disintegrated enemy soldiers and machines. So third point, an important aspect of the debate and perhaps central to the goal of scientizing the army or even the country was the scientific education of soldiers and the Chinese people in general. Many complained that Chinese soldiers lacked even a basic scientific mindset. Mining expert and US-educated chemist Lin Yong, for instance, gave a lecture during the Shanghai incident in 1932 about the lack of general scientific training in the Chinese army. Lin recounted how in his own experiences, particularly with Japanese gas operations, and argued that the Japanese attack had made the need for scientific research and the involvement of all possible scientific disciplines in planning and preparing for national defense obvious to everyone. The greatest concern of the Chinese army, Lin said, was that soldiers did not even have the most basic knowledge of modern science, including general principles, use, and manufacturing of scientific weapons. It was the government's responsibility to teach ordinary soldiers a scientific lifestyle, quote-unquote scientific lifestyle, before sending them back into battle. In addition, Zhu Kejun also pointed out China did not have the scientific research infrastructure and scientific pioneers that Europe or the United States had. However, this was not due to the mental deficiencies of the Chinese people, but due to the lack of money and a climate for scientific research in China. So many others too, in the context of the debate, demanded more and systematic funding of research and scientific institutions. So fourthly, many authors addressed the role of humans and the human body in contrast to machines and technology on the battlefield. While previous wars still had been wars of military personnel, the next wars would be purely wars conducted with scientific weapons and without the direct involvement of soldiers on the battlefield. Human bodies were no longer directly involved in the fighting, but they remained the primary target of destruction. Other texts, such as the Army's Scientific Warfare Volume, anticipated a silent battlefield, or silent battlefields in general, devoid of devastation and rivers of blood, since inaudible sound waves, for example, could kill enemy soldiers in an instant, or at least drive them mad. Another chapter in the scientific warfare book, titled The Age of Radio Control, looked at wars without humans, which would be replaced by unmanned aircraft, tanks, and ships. The wars of the future will not need human involvement, just an on and off switch in an electric room. The book quoted British military theoretician John Fuller to explain that every vehicle could be controlled wirelessly with electrical waves. Citing alleged Japanese experiments with remotely controlled tanks, the authors of Scientific Warfare warned that such weapons could be employed to invade China and even decide the outcome of the war. Although they still belong to the realm of fantasy, unmanned remotely piloted vehicles had to be reckoned with. Unmanned aerial vehicles, drones in other words, that could be used for reconnaissance, bombardments, or selecting artillery targets, as well as unmanned super heavy tanks, were devastating weapons which could surely appear on future battlefields. And again, they were serious about that. The use of remotely controlled technology made both human heroism and sacrifice obsolete. This aspect was fifth and finally directly related to the question of what role scientists played or should play in war. The next war, wrote one author, would not be decided by armies on weapons or physical force in human bodies, but by scientists who used all their knowledge and skills to research and invent new devices that could kill the enemy. Science, he wrote, must be used to, quote-unquote, protect the integrity of the Chinese territory and fight imperial invasion. Since modern war was a purely scientific war, anyone with at least basic scientific knowledge had to participate in peacetime war preparation and, quote-unquote, be prepared to make the greatest sacrifice for the existence of the nation and the people. So in this mindset, scientists became the new heroic national warriors. This point, and with it, the debate in general became increasingly nationalistic, and a group of scientists criticized another group of scientists who advocated pure science, stressing that as patriotic duty, much more research was needed in applied military-related fields. Yang Xiaoshu, founder of two popular science journals, argued that modern war was not simply fought between two armies, but between two peoples, including their science. So not their scientists, but their science. Preparations for war were based on the results of scientific laboratory research and technology rights. Scientific and economic strength during peacetime were the basis of power in war. Yet he emphasized the main purpose of science was not to provide the means for modern war, and that whether or not to go to war was a national decision, but war would make the value of science more apparent. So, echoing the proverb, prepare for war in peacetime, Zhu Kezhen, the meteorologist, similarly explained that while the purpose of scientific research was not specifically to prepare for war, its effectiveness is most evident in war. Scientific research, he said, was like personal hygiene, protecting the body when necessary. But isn't the purpose of science to search for the truth, rather than something as trivial as improving the living standards or even expanding the ways of killing people? He asked. And he also answered, if a neighboring country wantonly wages a war of aggression, invades my country, wreaks havoc among my people, and reduces our territory by 100 miles every day, he explained, then scientists could not just pursue their original goal, for that would be tantamount to committing suicide just to prove a point and adhere to noble principles. It would lead to the quote-unquote extinction of the Chinese people. So great responsibility for scientists. Consequently, Sun Keding, a mathematician and artillery specialist, called for all Chinese natural scientists to participate in the creation of a much-needed national defense science, or a people's self-defense science. Sun, as well as many other scientists, stated that science contributed to the development of society under normal conditions, but was being misappropriated to wage war. However, it was not science, but political and economic conditions that were the reasons for war. To end imperialist invasion, one last war in history of humankind was necessary, a quote-unquote war to end all wars, with the help of science. So, in conclusion, many authors or speakers before 1932 pointed out that since the World War I, science had turned war into an endless monstrosity, creating a new chapter of terrifying, catastrophic weapons of mass destruction, including airplanes, incendiary bombs, tanks, poison gas, and infectious germs. The more sophisticated and scientific weapons became, the greater the havoc they wreaked, not only on soldiers, but also on women, children, and everyone else. Weapons like death rays killed thousands in an instant. Biological weapons could even spell the end of humankind, changing the entire strategic rationale of starting wars. However, after the Shanghai incident in 1932, the military participation of Chinese scientists and the use of scientific research for military purposes was increasingly presented as a patriotic duty, essential for national survival. Scientists should oppose barbaric and brutal wars of aggression, but should participate in defensive war with all their scientific knowledge. The journalist and publicist Du Xiaofu stated that, quote-unquote, lagging behind in scientific research today means defeat in battle tomorrow. Other scientists justified their participation in war and service in the army by arguing that science helped limit the suffering and sacrifices of human lives. So some wrote about Chinese lives, others of lives in general. And for many scientists, the military need for scientific research was an opportunity to demand more resources and acceptance of science in China. H.C. Sen, or Ren Hongjun, then the Secretary General of Academia Sinica, wrote that there was still a widespread anti-modern opposition to or ignorance of science in China. Quote-unquote, using science for war is the necessary evil. To avoid war and save lives, we must not denigrate science, but vigorously promote it. Countries without developed science would be the prey of stronger countries and be invaded. The only way to defend oneself is, quote-unquote, fight them with their own weapons. There were a few critical voices questioning the use of scientists in armies and the development of military technology as an inevitable outcome of scientific research, arguing that science need not necessarily lead to ever more devastating weapons. But it was also doubted that scientists had control over how their findings were used, since they could not predict the outcome and potential use of scientific research. A few articles with headlines such as "War Rapes Science" criticized that scientists worldwide who enthusiastically lent their knowledge and skills to armies, including luminaries such as the Italian Marconi. Chinese science journals also reported about the protest of the international science community, including British, French, and other scientists against the appropriation of science and scientists for military purposes during World War II, and translated related letters and speeches. In the same way, some writers paradoxically hoped that science could and should help end all wars quickly, for example, by developing some kind of miraculous and harmless superweapon, including bombs to mass distribute sleeping gas. Others emphasized that scientific warfare and highly praised scientific weapons such as poison gas or death rays were of limited use. So scientific warfare remained a much debated topic throughout the Sino-Japanese War and World War II in China and after, with a tendency to idealize and perhaps overemphasize the importance of science to combat in armies, and even viewing war as a means to hastening human progress. Under the impact of the first use of atomic bombs and chemical and biological weapons, science and war were henceforth inextricably linked, according to many authors. So from now on, war would always be scientific war, and science would be concerned at least to an important part with the scientific defense of the nation. Thank you.